Hi, everybody. I'm Brittany Lewis, a breaking news reporter here at Forbes. Joining me now is Richard Betts, professor of War and Peace Studies at Columbia University. Professor Betts, thank you so much for joining me.
No, you're welcome.
Last week, the U.S. military released footage of what it said was a Russian jet intercepting a U.S. drone over the Black Sea. First and foremost, can you explain the significance of this incident?
Well, it's obviously a dangerous incident because it occurs when we're in a very tense relationship with Russia in a sort of proxy war. And an incident like this always raises the danger of an accidental or impetuous escalation of the conflict into a combat situation that neither side had intended. Now, we have a fairly well-established historical record of these sorts of incidents with intelligence collection systems not leading to further escalation, but the danger is always there. And even if it's usually a manageable risk, the potential consequences are pretty extreme.
On a macro level, I would love for you to dive into those previous incidents that we've seen. How similar are they, and what happens next?
Well, there are over the years, especially during the Cold War, many incidents of American ships or aircraft that were on routine intelligence collection missions, collecting electronic data of various sorts, being shot down or mistakenly attacked. So, for example, one of the most dramatic was when the American U-2 was shot down over the Soviet Union in 1960. And as a result, a summit meeting between President Eisenhower and Soviet leader Khrushchev that had been planned and for which a lot of people hoped there might be some important result was canceled. Also, there were periodically other incidents. For example, in the Middle East War in 1967, the Israelis mistakenly attacked the USS Liberty, a ship collecting intelligence. In 1969, the North Koreans shot down an EC-121 that was doing so. There was the seizure of the USS Pueblo in 1968 with the crew of the ship held prisoner for an entire year by North Korea. A number of other incidents. In more recent times, in 2001, the Chinese pilot doing things similar to what the Russian pilot was doing in the current incident accidentally hit our EP-3. The Chinese pilot was killed, and the American aircraft was damaged and had to land. And again, the Chinese held the crew for some time. So these sorts of incidents happen periodically. They remain, the effects in all cases remained under control, but the consequences in some of them were pretty bad. There were very high American casualties in the attack on the Liberty and the EC-121, and a major diplomatic and strategic crisis over the Pueblo. So there's always the risk that these accidents, which happen on routine missions, can balloon into something much bigger.
Professor, you mentioned that this comes at a time it's a really rocky time for U.S. Russia relations right now. It comes more than a year after Russia's invasion into Ukraine, and while the U.S. continues to supply Ukraine with aid and enforce economic sanctions on Russia. What does this do to U.S. Russia relations?
Well, this increases the tension with Russia about the contest over which side is going to prevail in Ukraine, because the Russians justifiably suspect that this American drone was collecting intelligence to pass on to the Ukrainians, which, as the Russian press spokesman said, would help the Ukrainians to kill Russians. I don't know exactly what the drone was doing, but it would be a reasonable deduction for them to think that. So out of concern for protecting one's own forces or for trying to coerce the United States into backing off from its support of Ukraine, it's understandable that they wanted to do something to disrupt the operation. They probably the pilot wound up doing something probably which was not in the plan, hitting the propeller and knocking it down, but that often happens when you're trying to deal with aircraft flying at high speeds. You can't control your plan for exactly how they're going to interact. So at this time, it simply worsens the overall tension between Washington and Moscow.
Let's break down the responses here, starting with the United States. White House National Security Council spokesperson John Kirby called the collision unsafe and unprofessional. Was that an appropriate response? What do you make of that?
Yes, well, it's the official spokesman has to some extent, use boilerplate language and make obvious sorts of criticisms. They have to be careful about what sort of line they take that may be interpreted as a threat or a promise. So it's an easy thing to say that it was unprofessional. For the pilot to hit the propeller of the plane is not obviously a way that a well-planned military operation would go. So that's a way of registering the American indignation, while at the same time not actually saying anything that boxes us in about how we would respond in a future case. Now, what's important now is the question of whether this happens again, and or whether the United States adjusts its intelligence collection operations to reduce this sort of risk. In other words, things could go in either direction. If the Americans become more cautious about how we send our aircraft to collect this sort of intelligence, then the Russians can think they've won something. And if the United States says we've got to show the Russians that nobody can push us around, as it were, then the Russians have an incentive to push back too, and this raises the risks of another possible incident.
Do you think that measured response was a little too cautious? Do you think there should have been more done on the U.S.'s end to respond tougher to this, or do you think that measured response was appropriate?
I think it was appropriate because there's no reason to make firm statements in public about exactly what the United States will or will not do. That would reduce our flexibility. It would increase our vulnerability to the other side exploiting whatever sort of wiggle room our statement seemed to leave. So some ambiguity is reasonable, and it also doesn't preclude other channels of communication. What's more important is what we tell the Russians secretly, not in a press conference, or what we ask allies to communicate to them. That where it's not complicated by the possible impact on public opinion or domestic politics or relations with allies is really the more important sort of communication. And we don't know exactly what sorts of points may be made in those channels.
Sure. And what does this type of incident do to those sorts of channels? Is there still that secret communication going on?
Well, we don't know. If it's secret by definition, we don't know. I'm sure that there are all sorts of initiatives through various channels, diplomatic, informal, and communications that journalists may make when they're traveling. There are all sorts of ways to get in touch. So I assume that a lot of that is going on, and we won't know about all of it until probably well after the main events have passed.
And Professor, I do want you to break down Russia's response to this. They called U.S. drone flights, quote, a provocation, and the Russian ambassador said this: the unacceptable activity of the U.S. military in close proximity to our borders is a cause for concern. What do you make of their response?
Well, it's predictable. The American position is what we were doing is perfectly legal under international law. We were in international airspace, not within Russian airspace. But at the same time, from the Russian point of view, they've got a war going on, and we're flying military aircraft very close to their airspace in a way that is designed to help their enemy defeat them. So it's understandable that they try to point out that we're operating very close to them, so that other countries may say, well, we can understand how you feel. So it's their way of protesting and saying what we're doing is unreasonable, even if it's not illegal.
Sure. And broadly speaking, what do you think is next for U.S. Russia relations? Where do we go from here?
Big question. The overall question being, how is the war in Ukraine going to evolve? Will it remain a stalemate? Will either side come closer to defeating the other? And what can the United States do about it? Excuse me. And there's really no good answer to those questions, because you can see a path to any of those three outcomes depending on particular decisions about policy in Moscow and Washington and Kyiv, and also the physical capacities of both sides. There's an open question now about whether the United States and its friends who are supporting Ukraine have the production capacity to keep Ukraine supplied with the munitions it needs. Similarly, the Russians are running into logistical and supply problems. If either side fixes those problems better than the other side does and begins to push the other side back consistently, then the question of what's next will have a different answer. If we have a stalemate for another year, then the odds grow that there will be more and more pressure for a truce of some sort, and a negotiation aimed at a settlement. There's no apparent movement towards that at the moment, because people on this side have hopes for a spring counteroffensive a little later in coming months. And the Russians have hopes for taking Bakhmut. So both sides think they still might start doing a lot better within the near future. And as long as that's true, there's probably not much diplomacy can do to shorten the war, apart from trying to support one side coming out on top of the other.
Professor, you mentioned the word truce, a potential truce within the next year. This upcoming year is an election year. Do you think that changes the balance in any way?
Well, nothing's ever irrelevant to an election. And the issue of American support for Ukraine has become more of an issue, in the sense that there is resistance among some Republicans, especially, to expending American resources and continuing to support Ukraine. The big question there is whether that resistance or opposition will grow. If it doesn't grow, it can probably be contained and American support will continue. And if it's feasible, technically and managerially, to accelerate it, that will probably happen too. As far as the election politics of it go, the best thing for the Biden administration, of course, would be for the Ukrainians to start winning and to be able to say American support has been worth it because justice is on the way. If the stalemate continues, then the anti-support opposition may well grow, and it could become a bigger issue in the election.
Professor Richard Betts, I appreciate your insights. Thank you for coming on.
You're welcome.